All right, welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started tonight, my friend Joanne Hulbert is here. I'm going to have her unmute because she has a poem for us, whether or not she told me before I got started that she thinks it's lame. Joanne, go get him.
All right. Yes. We can blame it all on you, Bruce, if it does fall flat, but that's okay. Anyway, I searched high and low to try to find a poem fitting for tonight from 1884. And I did come up with a couple that I have in my copious files and everything. Who figures? Anyway, both of them I thought were pretty lame, and that's what I said to Bruce. But he insists that we're going to be listening to this one, so we'll blame it on him if it does fall flat. But it's from 1884, and so let's take us back to that year, since we're going to be going back there for an hour anyway. All right. The title is In the Field. The skies are clear, the boys all cheer, for baseball season now is here. With bat in hand, the bowling band perambulate throughout the land. The sides installed, the time is called, and battled orders loudly brawled. With ringing shout, the players rout and try to put each other out. The pitcher, he, with savage glee, throws wildly with celerity. The catcher stands as he expands behind the bat with yawning hands. The umpire by with watchful eye looks out for balls that foully fly. He doth preserve an iron nerve, and from his duty ne'er will swerve. Don't worry, it's almost over. The game is o'er, the count, the score, and on sides very weak and sore, the doctor comes and blithely hums while fixing up their broken thumbs. Courtesy of San Jose, California Evening News, page 4, from May 3rd, 1884.
I
Ta-da.
distinctly see people on camera applauding and giving you a thumbs up right now, Joanne. So that sets the stage very well for us. Now, before we started with our feature presentation, I want to go to anybody in the crowd that is doing any research or doing anything great out there in terms of creating content. And I got one guy in here who can help me out. Jeff Cohen, what's going on with that great pot of yours, my friend?
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, if you remember back in the 90s, Generation K, Baseball and Barbecue has an interview with Bill Pulsifer, who has a terrific story to tell. He was supposed to be the next Tom Seaver of the Mets, and didn't turn out that way. But he has a heck of a story, so I encourage everybody to listen to Baseball and BBQ with Bill Pulsifer this week. Thanks, Bruce.
That pod is available on any of your podcatchers out there. Easy to find, easy to download, and it's a great listen. So now that we've gotten that far, it's on to our feature presentation. At the end of the 1883 baseball season, things looked rosy. Attendance had skyrocketed, and the National League and American Association were at peace. A year later, however, the sport was in total disarray. A third major league, the Union Association, had come on the scene and waged a bitter war that rocked the baseball world. By the dawn of the 1885 season, the UA had dissolved in a sea of red ink. The AA had dropped to 4 teams, and the minor leagues were desperately hoping to make it through the season. Amid the 1884 season were some historic moments. Ironman pitcher Charles Old Hoss Radbourne won 59 games and led the Providence Grays to victory over the New York Metropolitans in the first World Series. Fleet Walker broke baseball's first color line. There were a record 8 no-hitters and a cast of fascinating figures, some famous, some lost to history, like Hustling Horace Phillips, Dan O'Leary, and Edward the Only Nolan. This book tells the story of the momentous yet overshadowed 1884 season. Bill Ryczek is a SABR member and part of the Smokey Joe Wood chapter in Connecticut. He is the author of a trilogy on 19th century baseball. His books, Baseball's First Inning, When Johnny Came Sliding Home, and Blackguards and Red Stockings, cover the period from baseball's beginning through 1875. He was also co-editor of Baseball Founders and Baseball Pioneers, which provide comprehensive stories of baseball's earliest teams and players. And he's here tonight to discuss his newest book, Baseball's Wildest Season, 3 leagues, 34 teams, and the chaos of 1884. Bill Ryczek, welcome to Northern New England. How you doing tonight, Bill?
I'm doing great, Bruce. Thank you very much for having me on.
I am so happy you are here. Let me get this started for you so that you can jump right into your presentation.
Good. You fire up the slides and I'll get started. So many baseball book titles have subtitles. And you'll see, and I'm making these up, books like 1931, the most pivotal year in baseball's history. Or, Clint Courtney, the man who changed baseball forever. And I see some of these subtitles and titles, and I say, come on. So to call something baseball's wildest season, I think I need to have some pretty good reasons for doing that. Next slide, please, Bruce. And as Bruce hit some of the highlights of that season, but it struck me as incredible when I started looking at it. And my inspiration for this was an article long ago by the late Fred Ivor Campbell, who wrote a book about the 1884, or wrote an article about the 1884 season. And I read that and said, boy, a lot of things did happen here. And those of you who knew Fred was an excellent researcher, excellent writer, never wrote a book. And he would always look to other people to write what he wanted to read. And I think I've hopefully done that. You look at all the things that happened in 1884, it was the first season that had 3 major leagues, and one of the very few that had 3 major leagues. We've now had a lot of the Negro leagues classified as major leagues, but it's a little different. First of all, they didn't know it at the time, and second, they didn't compete with each other. The Negro leagues were not poaching players from the American and National League and vice versa. They operated in their own spheres. This season had 3 leagues that were at war with each other. I also had the first World Series. That's a big event. The first black major leaguer, another big event. Hoss Radbourne, 59 wins, never been equaled. Now, Fred Ivor Campbell's name comes up again in that because Hoss was always credited with 60 wins, and it was probably almost 40 years ago now. On the 100th anniversary of that season, Fred found out that one of those victories should not have been Hoss's. He relieved a starting pitcher who had gone over 5 innings left with a win. Under 1884 rules, Hoss got the win. Under today's rules, he would not, so he's back down to 59. And if you haven't read Ed Acorn's book, 59 and 84, I recommend doing it. It's a great read. It's all about Hoss Radbourne. Ed is a great writer. He's an award-winning writer, a real writer, not like those of us who do it nights and weekends. And it's an excellent book. You also had something you don't see very often. If 5 major league teams fail, that's a very unusual thing to happen. You had entire minor leagues collapsing. The Northwestern League went under before the season when almost every minor league went out of business. And you had a vicious war between the National League and the American Association on one hand and the Union Association on the other. As Bruce said, at the end of the 1883 season, everything looked really good. And what happens is so often what happens when things are good, they try to get to the next level and they really shouldn't. The American Association expanded from 8 to 12 teams. The Union Association came in, the minor leagues expanded, and it was just way too much. And it caused the kind of chaos that you have. You didn't have enough good players. You had a lot of competition for players. You didn't have enough fans. You had you really didn't have enough to sustain all those teams. And that's what created the chaos. Next slide, please, Bruce. And the structure of the book, and it's not formally divided that way, but we got a prologue that gets us up to 1884. And then really the two subjects, 2 bullets in the middle are really the main subjects. First is a description of what baseball was like in 1884. And the second is the 1884 season. And then we have the last chapter, which is what happened between the 84 and 85 season, which was almost as dramatic as what happened during the season. Now, whenever I write a book, I don't start out with an outline. If you go to a writing class, they'll say, start with an outline, what you're going to write about, and then you follow that outline. What I do is just start going to the material. Look at all the background material, read the newspapers, look at the journals, read some books, but mostly look at what happened and what people said about it at the time. and then see where that takes me. If I were to do an outline of the book ahead of time, it probably wouldn't have taken the same structure as it eventually did, because there are a lot of things that I didn't know about when I would have been doing the outline. And that's one of the things. Let's for example, the Northwestern League. I wound up doing a presentation on the Northwestern League at the Fred Ivor Campbell the Fred Conference in Cooperstown. I never would have thought about writing about the Northwestern League, but the more I started reading about it, the more fascinating it became. You'd have a team go down, another team would replace it. That team would go down. They kept replacing teams. Players were jumping all over the place because the players realized the team was about to fold. They were gone. And eventually they wound up with 2 teams. And then they wound up with no teams. The whole league went down in early September. I've written about minor league football. And what I found is with minor leagues, there are secrets to success, or at least survival. And then for most minor leagues, survival is success, is a geographically compact footprint and keeping salaries down. Basically, keep your expenses down. And the Northwestern League, the Eastern League did everything wrong. They had geographic footprints that were way too big. The travel expenses were way too much. In order to compete, they started paying higher salaries. The salaries in the Northwestern League were almost equal to major league salaries, as well as the Eastern League that followed the same path. And that just leads to chaos and failure. The summer was just an adventure. And if you've done research, one of the joys, particularly with all the online resources we have now, is following newspapers day by day. And you don't have to wait till the next day to find out what went on. You just keep reading newspapers. And what's going to happen now? What's going to happen now? And it was really a drama in many ways, that whole season, much more so than other seasons I've researched. The baseball in 1884 section is what baseball was like. What were the players like? How much did they make? Where did they come from? What were their demographic characteristics? How was the game played? Sunday baseball was a huge thing back then. How was the schedule developed? What was the conflict over Sunday baseball? There were the smaller teams, and there were way too many smaller teams, needed Sunday baseball to survive. And Sunday baseball was generally prohibited in the Northeast, which was much more religious, Protestant, Puritan. Those of you from the Massachusetts chapter know that they had a lot of Puritans back then, and their morality pretty much dominated. So Sunday baseball didn't take place in Boston until well into the 20th century, same as New York. But in the Midwest, it was not quite that way. You had a lot of Germans in the upper Midwest who liked their beer, liked to have a good time on Sunday. But there were a lot of shenanigans as trying to get around Sunday baseball, because those were when the biggest crowds were. People worked 6 days a week for the most part. They were off on Sunday. When could you draw your crowd? The one day you couldn't play. So there was a lot of legal posturing. There were arrests. Players were arrested for playing on Sunday. But a lot of things went on in baseball in 1884. And part of it is the players. I had a section on called The Drunks. Alcohol played a far greater role than I ever would have imagined. And I'll get more of that later. Next, please, Bruce. It says first back one. That first section, baseball in 1884, is really divided into several chapters. What was the United States like back then? What was the economy like? Because in many cases, the success of baseball is related to the economy of the United States. After the panic of 1873, baseball had a real down period. By 1884, 1882 and 3 were 2 fantastic years for baseball. The economy was good. 1884, the economy started to dip a little. Too much competition, it wasn't quite as good. And if you look through baseball history, the success of baseball has really contributed to the economy of the United States. Talked about the way the game was played, the rules, the pitching. And we'll talk more about the pitching later, what the players were like. And then chapters on different groups, the magnets, which we're going to get to one at a time, the promoters, the umpires, and as I said before, the drunks. So let's go to the magnets. And fellow on the left, in case you don't recognize him, we put a basketball there with his name on it, Albert Spalding. The war with the Union Association was going on, and Spalding was the general. Spalding was never the president of the league, but he was the power behind the throne. He was the one they listened to. He was the one who was determined to drive the Union Association out of business. And he did. The man in the middle is John Day, who was the owner of the Metropolitan Exhibition Company, which owned both the New York National League Club and the Metropolitans of the American Association. Nowadays, we would see that as a conflict of interest, with someone owning two teams and two different leagues. They weren't as squeamish about it back then. You read and hear a lot about how tough the owners were on the players. Arthur Soden of the Boston team was notoriously penurious. Players had to launder their own uniforms. They had to buy their own, shoes, their gloves. They had to pay for their expenses when they were traveling. A lot of things like that. Day was actually pretty well liked by his players. And he was asked, in fact, to become the president of the Players League in 1890, and he declined to do that. The man on the right is one of the great characters in 19th century baseball. I'm sure many of you know who he is, Chris Van der Aa. One of the things I learned a couple of years ago was how to properly pronounce his name. As the biographer Tom Hetrick told us, it is Van der Aa. Chris was ahead of his time, and he suffered the fate of many people who were ahead of their time. He was one of the first people to understand that baseball was entertainment and promotion. He had a circus and carnival-like atmosphere at the park. He encouraged his manager to argue with umpires because he thought the fans liked it. He knew nothing about baseball. He was a German immigrant, came to the United States to run a saloon, but thought he knew a lot about baseball and used to tell his managers what to do, who to pitch, who to put in the lineup, things like that. And if you're thinking George Steinbrenner, you're absolutely correct. He was very much like Steinbrenner, and like Steinbrenner, he went through a lot of managers. He managed the team himself for a while, which Steinbrenner, I'm sure, would have loved to do, but couldn't because it was against the baseball rules at that time. But Van der Aa had a lot of problems. He had a very tempestuous personal life. He had multiple marriages, multiple affairs, women chasing him down the street, hitting him with umbrellas, that kind of stuff. Two women who thought they were going to marry him at the same time. And that tends to be way heavily on the pocketbook. He got divorced a couple times, and also overextended himself. He was a combination of George Steinbrenner and Bill Veeck. And like Veeck, he made a lot of enemies. He wound up being eventually broke and run out of baseball, and died in very sad circumstances. Next. This was possibly my favorite chapter. And that guy in the middle is one of my favorite people. I also did a presentation on him at Cooperstown. The man on the left, it's very appropriate. It's a very shady image of him because Dan O'Leary was a very shady character. He was sometimes called Hustling Dan O'Leary, but just known as Dan O'Leary. And now to make another 20th century analogy, if you think of Billy Martin, O'Leary was almost a 19th century Billy Martin. He got a lot of managing gigs because Billy Martin was very good at winning championships. Dan O'Leary was very good at doing something that 19th century managers had to do, which was recruit the team. Yeah, Billy Martin didn't recruit the players. The manager in the 19th century had to go out and find the players. And Dan and everybody you see in this slide was very good at doing that. They didn't always tell the truth. They promised things they didn't always follow through on, but they were very good at recruiting players. And Dan, like Billy Martin, liked to drink. And when he drank, like Billy Martin, he got himself in trouble. He didn't get into fist fights, but he would end up saying things. He would insult the board of directors of the team he was managing. He would say something that he shouldn't. He would end up ordering beer for all his players and get them drunk. And one thing Dan said was that he never told his players not to drink, which is very unusual in the 19th century, because he said, if I let them go out and drink, they'll go out, get drunk, be back early, get a good night's sleep, and be ready to play the next day. If I try to chase them around and keep them in the hotel, they'll be running around all night. And they won't get back till 2 in the morning, and then they'll be tired, won't be able to play. But Dan usually had a pretty good team, but he went from one place to another. He would front a team. In 1884, he got fired a couple of times, and he bounced around a lot, and always was on the shady side of everything. And I did put a story in there, and a Bill Stern story about Dan O'Leary, which was complete fabrication. And it's too long to tell here. It's in the book, but it's one of those things only Bill Stern would come up with. The guy in the middle, another one of my favorite characters, Hustling Horace Phillips. I said Dan O'Leary is sometimes called Hustling Dan. Hustling Horace, better alliteration anyway, was always called Hustling Horace Phillips. And Horace was also incredibly good at two things. One, recruiting players, generally by telling them whatever they wanted to hear. And two, he was very good at filling up a schedule. The manager did everything in those days. Manager usually did not direct the team on the field. That was the captain. But the manager had to schedule all the games because the league had a schedule. But one of the big most important jobs of the manager was to fill all those open dates in the league schedule with exhibition games where they could make money. So, and Horace was incredibly good at that, as was the man on the right, Frank Bancroft. They would brag that from April 1st to July 12th, they had no open dates. They were booked every single day. They were traveling somewhere. Of course, that tended to wear down the players who had no off days. And the pitchers in those days, you might have two pitchers. So you had the pitchers throwing exhibition games. And we talk about the pitchers later. We'll talk about that, throwing an incredible number of innings. But Horace, again, moved around a lot. Wasn't much of a player. As a manager, he didn't have great results, but he was always in demand. And if he wasn't in demand, he was in demand by owners and usually in demand by law enforcement agencies. He was found to steal money from the teams he managed. When he was manager of Columbus in, I think, 1883, they sent a board member on the road just to watch him and make sure he didn't steal any money. He would skip out on hotel bills. He got arrested for that. He was always in some type of trouble. And Horace eventually ended his career. He landed in Pittsburgh for several years as a manager and went to a hotel one day with the team and started acting very strangely. He told the desk clerk that he owned all the major league teams and several hotels, and he would like the clerk to be his partner. And we started talking, going on and on. The clerk called a doctor. Horace wound up in an asylum, and that's where he died several years later. No one knew what happened to him after he was hustled off to the asylum. And Peter Morris, who was incredible at tracking down people, found out what happened to him. He eventually died in an institution for what they called then the insane. The person on the right is a little more respectable than either Dan O'Leary or Hustling Horace Phillips. And Frank was the manager of the Providence Grays, who won the first World Series ever. Frank was also very good at filling up a schedule. He was, again, not above a little dodginess, but not to the level of the first two. He lasted a long time in baseball, well into the 20th century as a manager, and very well thought of, much more so than the first two. Let's go on to two more promoters. Man on the left, Jim Mutry in New York. He was the manager of the Metropolitans, who lost the first World Series, later went on to manage the National League Gothams, who were became the Giants. And they were called the Giants by the late 1880s, who got to the World Series twice. Like most of the managers, Jim would skirt the truth. He was known as Truthful Jeeves, somewhat sarcastically. Peter Mancuso wrote a great SABR biography of Jim Mutry. which I got a lot of information from, and it's really an interesting one. The guy on the right, another is the biography just came out about him about a year ago. He is Ted Sullivan. And one of the things we find when we research these eras, that people who are very little known today were very big in their day. And Ted Sullivan was one of those people. O'Leary and Phillips were marginal, shady characters. But Ted Sullivan was a big man. And why? He was not much of a player. He played a little bit. Not a very good manager. Didn't have much experience. But Ted was good at organizing leagues and scouting. Those are his two things. He organized many, many leagues, and too many to list here. They're in the book. He discovered Charles Comiskey and was his mentor for a long time. And he was one of the best judges of talent, according to most of his contemporaries. Again, well into the 20th century, discovered a number of early 20th century stars. And he would always be quoted in the sporting news. You go to the sporting news of the 19 teens and 20s, they're always quoting Ted Sullivan, what Ted thinks about something. He was one of the wise old men of baseball. Ted also was a little fast and loose with the truth. Someone said, Ted can always tell stories that they've never heard before. And the reason they never heard them before is because most of them weren't really true. There were these tall tales about somebody in Africa, a lot of racist stories, which are embarrassing today. But Ted had a lot of stories, and he had a good imagination. He was one of the great characters and one of the great magnets of promoters in the 19th century. So, when Ted did, he had, and since we're talking about 1884, let me go on a little. I think we got time. Ted had his 1884 season is typical of a manager of that era. In 1883, he had quit as manager of St. Louis because he didn't get along with Chris Von der Rohe. Von der Rohe was trying to tell him what to do, how to run the team. Sullivan was very thick-headed about things like that. He got two strong-willed people. Again, Steinbrenner and Billy Martin. Ted quit. In 1884, he had agreed to manage the Richmond team of the Eastern League. But then Henry Lucas, the founder of the Union Association, offered a lot more money to manage his St. Louis Maroons. So he jumped his Richmond contract to manage the Maroons. And the Maroons were just by far and away the best team in the league. They got off to a fantastic start, but Ted wasn't getting along with his players. The players ganged up against him. He quit. He moved on. He wound up in Kansas City, which was brought into the league to replace Altoona. Kansas City, he said he wasn't a great manager. He managed Kansas City to a record of 16-63. That doesn't seem to say much about his ability, but he was able to do two things. One, the team actually got better toward the end. They were even worse than that going on, and he kept changing players, bringing in more players, and actually won about half of their last 13 or 14 games. But the greatest miracle of all was that he brought the team home. They finished, first of all, the team that bad could finish the season was an accomplishment. And second of all, they reportedly made money. When you have a team, so many teams are going out of business and losing money. Ted somehow managed to make money with a team that was really bad in a city that was not the greatest city to draw. And that's part of Ted's talents and ability. Next slide, please. Another one of the big events of the 1884 season was breaking the color line. The picture on the left is a picture you may well be familiar with, Fleetwood Walker. If you ask any casual or even a little more than casual baseball fan today, who broke the color line in baseball, the answer is going to be Jackie Robinson. If you ask somebody who was really, really deeply into the 19th century baseball, they might say William White. William White played in 1879 for Providence, one game, but William White was 75% white and lived as a white person. Fleetwood Walker was the first black person who was openly acknowledged as black. I mean, everyone thought of him as black. He thought of himself as black. So therefore, in my opinion, we would make him the first black player. He started out, he was like Jackie Robinson, very well educated, very erudite, and very well respected. He started, his first game was in Louisville. What I found interesting is there was very little publicity about it. They never said, here's the first Negro to play. Here is the Earth, a really historical event. None of that. They mentioned his name in the game story, mostly because he had a bad day throwing. One of the reasons he might have had a bad day throwing is because the fans in Kentucky probably wasn't the best place for him to make his debut. They were very hard on him, and he, I think, was feeling a little pressure. He lasted only that season, was injured, was threatened, was not treated well. His brother Welday also signed with Toledo and played a few games after they had injuries. He was really just a injury fill-in. Fleet was the one they wanted. The gentleman on the right, his name is Sandy Nava. He's also known by a few other names. He was known as Vincent Irwin, Sandy Irwin. I think I missed one here. Was he? They got several names. And he started with Providence in 1882. He was the first major leaguer of Mexican descent. His ancestry is very murky. Not sure exactly who his father was, but it's clear his mother was Mexican. There's no doubt of that. She later married a man named Irwin. That's whose name he took on, Sandy Irwin, and he became later known as Sandy Nava when he was playing. And what these two had in common, Nava and Fleet Walker, is that they were very good defensive catchers. And in that era, a defensive catcher was probably the most important person on the field, more important than the pitcher. Their hitting was almost like the pitchers of the 20th century. You could be a catcher and hit 180 with no power, but if you were a good defensive catcher, you'd be in the lineup. So defensive catchers were at a premium, and they wore out because they were always injured. Nava and Fleet were always injured during that season, but a catcher was a very valuable commodity. And that may have been why they were allowed to play, not because people were open-minded, but because we really need a catcher. They're really hard to find. I guess maybe we'll go with these guys. And it's also interesting to note that after the league contracted and the UAA went out of business in 1885, that was the end of Fleet Walker and pretty much the end of Sandy Nava. Played another year or two sporadically. But with more players around, fewer demand, they didn't need to go outside what they had traditionally gone outside. So next. One thing Bruce mentioned when he introduced me is that there are a lot of forgotten people from that era. And Hoss Radbourne is certainly well known among the 19th century crowd. And he's known among a lot of people who don't know a lot about 19th century baseball. 59 games, Ironman performance, all those complete games, pitched through a sore arm, pitched to the championship. But look at Guy Hecker, who almost no one outside of the real 19th century nuts know. And he had one of the best seasons in 1884 that any pitcher has had in the history of baseball. Unfortunately, he chose the year that Hoss Radbourne probably had the best year anybody ever had in baseball. Now, if you line them up, Radbourne's just a little bit better. A few more wins, a few more strikeouts, 8 more innings, 1 more complete game. ERA is a little better, but 1.80 is not bad. But the difference with Hecker is Hecker was a really good hitter. Hecker played regularly at first base in the outfield. In fact, in his major league career, he played more games at first base in the outfield than he played as a pitcher. And that year, he batted .297 at 94 hits. And 2 years later, he batted .341 and 343 at bats. So he was the all-around player. Radbourne, and most players in that era could hit. Most pitchers could hit. But Radbourne was not a great hitter. He was a poor hitter. But Hecker was a pitcher who was almost as good, and could also hit. And fortunately, like most of the players of that era, he's largely forgotten. Okay, next. 1884 was a year of the pitcher. And from baseball's professional baseball's first days, the pitching changed a lot. They started out 45 feet away, throwing completely underhanded with a stiff wrist. Then the front line of the pitcher's box was moved back to 50 feet. It was not a pitching rubber. There was a line. You had to stay behind that line, and you could run up to the line. So you could start 10 steps behind the line, come running up, and as long as you threw it before you approached that line, it was legal. And a lot of pitchers went over the line. What you'd find the other team doing if they thought a pitcher was going over the line, they'd throw some rocks and put some rocks in front of the line. So they'd end up hitting the rocks and hurting and twisting their ankles. And the biggest change in 1884 was that for the first time, a National League pitcher could throw with an unrestricted motion. They could throw overhand. The limits had gradually gone up. It went from underhanded to below the waist and then below the shoulder. And eventually in 1884 for the National League, it was any angle. The American Association, it was below the shoulder. But that was usually ignored. And pitchers were throwing above the shoulder and the umpires didn't call it half the time. And what that meant was they could throw a lot harder. In 1876, the first year of the National League, there were 589 strikeouts in 520 games. So a little more than one a game. In 1883, there were 2,877 strikeouts in 790 games, which is about 4.5 a game. Now, 4.5 a game is nothing in today's game, but going from 1 to 4.5 was a huge change. And a lot of the critics then think like what people think now. There's too many strikeouts, too much pitch and catch. The fielders aren't getting involved. And people were concerned about that. In 1884, it seemed like they had a reason to be concerned. There were 8 no-hitters that year. And that was the record well into the 21st century, rather, for the most no-hitters in a year. The National League ERA was less than 3. And the last bullet, Jim Galvin's remarkable streak. Galvin was baseball's first 300-game winner, and depending on what you believe, maybe the first user of performance-enhancing drugs. His biographer, Chip Martin, wrote some interesting things in regard to that. Galvin was a workhorse for Buffalo in 1884. Started 72 games through 636 innings, won 46 games. And the streak I'm referring to occurred during a 6-day period in August. He pitched a no-hitter, a 1-hitter, and a 3-hitter within 6 days. That's 4 hits and 27 innings. It's remarkable they were able to pitch that level. And Galvin pitched for a number of years at that level. Well, his arm was sore. And when I talked earlier about how managers tried to fill up every date with exhibition games, let's say you're Buffalo. You want to go to the hinterlands and play an exhibition game. Who do the fans pay to see? Jim Galvin. So he would pitch. He maybe didn't pitch the whole game, but when you see these statistics like Hoss Radbourne pitching 679 innings, that's only in the regularly scheduled games. He was, I'm sure, well over 700, maybe 800 in all exhibition games and regular games. Some statistics I saw on Larry Corcoran, who's pitcher for the White Sox, that the one year he pitched something like 920 innings in 1 year. Those guys didn't last all that long. Okay. Next. You had 3 leagues. Here's the National League standings. Now, it looks from those standings that the race wasn't very close. But for most of the summer, it was very close. Boston and Providence had a real battle, and they played a number of games together. It featured good baseball, good games, big crowds, especially in Boston. Providence never drew that well. And because the cities were so close, they would have a series and go back and forth between the 2 cities. It wasn't like they played a 4-game series in Boston and 3 in Providence. There was one 7-game series in June. They had a game in Providence, a game the next day in Boston. Then they took Sunday off, which they always did. Then there was a game in Providence, 1 in Boston, 2 in Providence, and the last one in Boston. They'd go back and forth, and a lot of the fans went back and forth as well. So the race was very tight until Providence swept the series from Boston, went on a 20-game winning streak, and basically knocked Boston out. Boston played very well at that stretch as well, but Providence just played better. And during that streak, Radbourne pitched 18 of the 20 games. Okay, next. American Association was a little bit closer. There were a lot of teams in contention during the final month before the Metropolitans clinched the title. And the fact that they won the pennant was quite a surprise. Because as I said earlier, the Metropolitan Exhibition Company owned both the Metropolitans and the Gothams of the National League. And the National League being the more prestigious league, the older league, the idea was that the company would put their best players in the National League team and the less talented ones in the American Association. And what happened was the Gothams didn't do that well in the National League, and the Metropolitans surprised everybody by winning the American Association championship. They were never expected to win. They were the weak sisters. They were the ones that had the players the Gothams didn't want, but they wound up winning. One of the big surprises was Columbus finishing second. They'd been 32-65 the year before under Hustling Horace Phillips, and they turned it around and finished second with 69-39. Right at the bottom of the standings was Washington, which didn't finish the season. All the National League teams made it to the finish line. Washington of the American Association did not. And that's somewhat of an interesting story about Lloyd Moxley, who was the president of the Washington club. And Moxley was somewhat of a shady character. And he was, one night in April 1865, he was standing outside Ford's Theater, shooting the breeze with a gentleman named John Wilkes Booth. And later on that night, when he found out what had happened and what Booth had done after their conversation, he went into hiding because he was afraid someone had seen them together and would think he was a conspirator. And that's not a silly thought, because in the days after Lincoln's assassination, they were rounding up everybody who might possibly have been associated with Booth. And he went into the countryside, hid out long enough, and never was accused of doing anything. And he wound up running the Washington team, which didn't last the season. They ran out of money in I forget it was July or August. Players, they weren't paying the players. The players had it. That was the end of the team. Okay, next. Well, this is we talked about teams failing. The rest of them were here. You see the asterisk: the Chicago-Pittsburgh team, Philadelphia, Altoona, Wilmington. Henry Lucas was the owner and founder of the Maroons, and really he ran the league. He said one time, whatever what I want is what's going to happen in the league. My word is the league's word. And if he had been more concerned about the league, he might have had a more balanced situation. But when you want to have a major league team, you don't want to have a second place team. He was determined to win. He got all the best players. He dominated the league, and really lost interest. When you look at the distance between the first and really, say, Cincinnati being the second best team, it's a huge difference. And there was no interest in the pennant race at all. The first team to go down was Altoona, which came as no surprise to anyone, because biggest question was, why is Altoona in the league? They needed a team to balance off, give them an even number of teams. They'd gone through a lot of other teams, weren't interested. Let's go to Altoona. It's a railroad hub. Maybe they'll draw. They didn't draw. They didn't last very long. They lasted till the end of May. They went down, and they were replaced by Kansas City. And Kansas City did make it to the end, as I said earlier. Then Philadelphia went down. They're replaced by Wilmington. Wilmington made it 18 games, only won 2 of them. Then they collapsed. They were replaced by Milwaukee and St. Paul. Milwaukee and St. Paul came from the Northwestern League, which had completely fallen apart by that time, and they finished out the season. Say Lucas had begun 1884 looking to challenge the American Association and the National League, but by the time they got to the end of the year, it was clear they couldn't make it another year, and his only hope was to somehow get into one of the other leagues, and he did. Okay, next. Prior to 1882, there was only one league, so there was no World Series. In 1883, they had two leagues, but there was no thought of a World Series. Probably in 1884, there was sort of a haphazard negotiation between Jim Mutry and Frank Bancroft. Well, if we win, we'll challenge you. It wasn't as if the league said there's going to be a World Series. And that was the case for several years. It was up to the two teams to challenge, to set the arrangements, make the arrangements. There was no league oversight to any of this. So we just accidentally wound up with this World Series. Almost didn't happen because each manager accused the other of reneging on an agreement. But they did it. All three games were in New York. Both managers wanted that because they thought they would draw much better in New York than in Providence. Unfortunately, the Dames were very disappointed. Radbourne won all three games. Total attendance was about 4,000. The weather was terrible. For the first World Series, it couldn't have gone worse, but it was the first. So we didn't have a World Series. We had a world champion for the first time. And from 1885 until the American Association collapsed, we had a World Series every year. It was not called the World Series in 1884. I think they call it the World's Series in 1885 for the first time. But we go back now, we call it the World Series. Next. The off season was almost more exciting than the season. The biggest event was the end of the Union Association and the admission of Henry Lucas and his Maroons to the National League. After calling him the devil, or you used to call him the wrecker, all season and saying what a horrible person he was, they let him into the league. And the reason they let him into the league, because with him out of the Union Association, that was the end of the Union Association. It was the end of the battle for salaries, and salaries went down significantly. So a lot of players out of work. They wanted to destroy the Union Association, and they did. The American Association contracted from 12 to 8 teams. Columbus and Toledo dropped out. Indianapolis and Richmond were asked to leave. Cleveland dropped out of the National League, which made room for Lucas. Now, with teams leaving the major leagues, that left a lot of players looking for jobs. If teams did not trade players or buy and sell players, what they would do is release them. And after 10 days after their release, they could be signed by someone else. And the biggest scandal of that offseason was when Cleveland dropped out. Brooklyn hired the former Cleveland manager, Charlie Hackett. And they hired him with the provision that he would recruit his former Cleveland players to play for Brooklyn. So they got their release. Hackett traveled around beforehand trying to get them to agree to sign with Brooklyn, because the weakness of this release then sign is the players could agree to sign, but in that 10 days they could sign with somebody else. So he convinced his players to sign with Brooklyn. They got released, and then they took them into a hotel and hid them out. So the other teams supposedly couldn't find them. There are rumors they were all over the place in Canada, God knows where. They were actually, I believe, somewhere around Cleveland. So, and a few minutes after midnight on the 10th day, they signed with Brooklyn. It caused a huge uproar because the comparisons to slavery, buying and selling bodies, buying and selling players. But that was, within a few years, that was pretty much the way that business was done. The Metropolitans, who won the American Association Championship, were rumored to be going out of business. They were going to combine with Brooklyn. They were going to combine with the Gothams. They were going to just go out of business. They're going to be replaced by someone else. They wound up playing another in 1885. But how often does a league champion rumored to be disbanding? Tony Mullane, who was always in trouble for contract problems, got in trouble again. He was suspended for a year. A.G. Mills resigned as president. He was kind of a reluctant president the first time in the National League. Nick Young was elected in his place and ended up serving for many years. Nick Young was just the guy who was next in line. Really, he was sort of the Ford Frick of the 19th century. Not his problem. Nice guy, went along with everything. And with that, they went on to 1885, which is another story in itself. That's it. Questions have been flying across the screen here, and I haven't really been reading them. So do you want to, are those somewhere, Bruce, where we can see them?
So usually in these meetings, there's a lot that goes on in the chat, a lot of comments, and joking and whatnot. But if you have a question this evening for our presenter, Bill Ryczek, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit that react button. Then you will see another button marked raise hand. Click that button and we will get you in line for comments and questions of our presenter, Bill Ryczek, this evening. I love these stories because to me, I'm a 60s and 70s baseball guy. That's my wheelhouse. And what I find is when somebody starts talking about this time period of Major League Baseball, I get so fascinated with these stories because they're so completely wild and unbelievable, but they actually did happen.
Oh, well, the drinking was really when they were talking about a player, it would be, well, he's a good hitter, a good fielder, but he drinks too much. It would always be his drinking. And Chris Vonderhaar said, I'd pay a manager $3,000 a year, which was a lot of money. And all he would have to do was keep the team sober. And with Vonderhaar's team, that would have been difficult because these guys were in jail. They were being arrested. They were chasing women. I mean, there's far more stories than I could tell you about in a half an hour and 45 minutes. But yeah, there is. That's what's amazing to me. All these crazy stories of, people doing things that we would never imagine could happen today.
Chris Vonderhaar was the subject of a fantastic episode of This Week in Baseball History, a podcast done by two SABR members, Bill Parker and his partner, his name just left me, and he's going to strangle me when he sees this on YouTube. Search them out. It's a really good episode, really terrific commentary on Vonderhaar. This is a terrific book from Ben Alter. Mr. Ryczek painted a wonderful picture of late 19th century baseball, how baseball affected the growing country, and how the growing country and expanding technologies affected baseball.
But you tend to forget what's what. And one thing that really struck me is, again, they're trying to sign players, and someone made a phone call saying they were using the telephone back then to call the managers, but they weren't, and that was kind of unusual. It was a big deal to make a phone call, but they called one of the managers and said, get down to St. Louis and sign this guy. And you realize where the technology was. Train travel had really changed the way they were able to expand these leagues. So many things were happening, but the population expansion to the west.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mike Bates and Bill Parker. Those are the two voices behind This Week in Baseball History. Look them up. Let's go to Dan Mason, who's got his hand up. Dan, how you doing?
Hey, Bill, I got a question for you. There are a lot of guys that drive line, tread, all those kind of advanced pitching facilities, and they would love to have a mound 50 feet away that players could run up and throw from. Can you just talk more about that? Because that seems to be a tremendous advantage to me that people would want to stop.
Yes, and they did. That's why I had, when you say mound, I have to catch myself. There was no mound. Right. When you're writing a book and say someone was driven from the mound, to go back, no, he wasn't. It was a box. It was flat ground. But yes, it was just a line. It was a line drawn with chalk or lime or something. And you could run and you could make all these elaborate motions. These guys would jump around. And there was a guy who pitched before that. It was Jumping Jack Jones. Have you ever heard that name? He was a Yaley. And he had this motion where he jumped in the air, threw his arms and legs out, and then pitched. And I don't think he was incredibly, it didn't have a lot of speed, but it was so distracting that for a while he was very good. But you could do all these contortions on the mound. And then it was, I'm sure, to see it in person was really unbelievable.
Bill had mentioned the Ivor in Cooperstown. The Frederick Ivor Campbell 19th Century Baseball Conference will be held April 25th and 26th, 2025 in Cooperstown, New York this year. Let's go to our friend Dixie Tarango. Dixie, how you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Good to see you.
Bill, I'm sorry you didn't come to the Southern Rhode Island thing a couple of weeks ago.
Well, I'd always gone every year, and now my daughter lives in North Carolina, and we've made it a tradition to go down there for Thanksgiving. So I'm sorry to have missed that.
Okay, my Well, first of all, I had the pleasure of playing for the Providence Grays in 1984 because the first convention I ever went to was in Providence, and they had a recreation game, and I was the leadoff batter for Providence when we got to play a couple innings at McCoy Stadium.
You were a young guy then.
I was very young. I could actually hit and run around, which is no longer the case. As for your book and everything, I've been doing research the last couple of months, and 1884 was the explosion of strikeouts because of the 5 or 6 players, pitchers who managed to strike out more than 400 guys in a season. All of them are 1880s pitchers. Between 1884, 5, and 6. That's when it happened because of the changes in the rules, and they were all, most of them were left-handed throwers, but they were all crazy pitchers, and they would just run and fling the ball. But all of them who were able to do that the best struck out more than 400 guys in the seasons.
Yeah, and you had the change in pitching rules. You had the run up, the jumping, and it also helps when you pitch 600 innings.
Yes,
you want to get a lot of strikeouts. Yeah, it was, and that's why I say this year just fascinated me. There's so many things happened, so many things changed. You look at maybe 1877 through 1880. There's not a lot that changed, but this year the things just happened. So many firsts. Yeah, and I see Jeff Cohen and no Tommy John surgeries. They right? just kept pitching. Hoss Radbourne's arm was so bad by the end of that year. He would go out and he would start throwing, and then he would try to throw a little harder. He had a sidearm throw, mostly because he couldn't lift his arm above his shoulder. And by the end of and Ed Acorn writes very well about that. His arm was just, ragged, and they all were. I mean, and one of the reasons I think some of those guys drank was because their arms hurt so much. It's just
that's a good point.
Pain medication.
And Hugh One Arm Daly only had one arm.
Oh, there you go.
Well, actually, he should have been called One Hand Daly. He actually had an arm. He's just missing a hand. And then Hugh Daly, I wrote about him. He said, generally, people are sympathetic to people with physical handicaps. He beat the odds. People hated him. He was just obnoxious. Everywhere he went, people hated him. He never lasted more than a year anywhere. And his teammates disliked him. The fans disliked him. I mean, he was just a really nasty guy.
Sounds like Martin at his finest.
19. What's that?
Sounds like Billy Martin at his finest.
Billy Martin had some charm about him.
That's true.
People liked him or didn't like him, but a lot of 20th century analogies here.
It's just it's the difference in the sport between the time you write about and now is large, but the connections are so tight. And the stories are just fantastic to hear. Like I say, they're so unbelievable until you start hearing more and you realize, wait a minute, this stuff actually did happen.
Yeah, you got like in this story, which I didn't tell, the one about Dan O'Leary, which Bill Stern made up, is way too long to tell, but it just killed me. I just happened to hear it. I had an audio recording of Bill Stern, and he starts talking about Dan O'Leary. Dan O'Leary, oh my God. And it's way out there, but these guys are. What I always like to do is really we think of them as historical figures, almost one-dimensional. But you think they were people. How did they think? What were they like? What were they surrounded by? And how did that make them think? And what do we have in common with them? And then you see all the motivations that were there that are very similar to the motivations we have today.
Mm-hmm. Joe Ross has a great comment in the chat. The arms were just strong enough to lift the glass of beer.
Yes, absolutely.
My comment. I'm going to take my time machine back to the 1880s and give Tommy John surgeries.
Right?
Oh my God. Yeah.
I'm going to say, hey, what's this process you have? Here's a Tommy John surgery for you, my friend. It's going to fix your pitching.
Yeah.
You have to give the surgery with only ether as an anesthetic and hope that you don't get overcome by it and pass out during the surgery. Okay. Bill, tell them how to get that book, man.
Well, you can go to McFarlandPub.com. It's on McFarland. You can go to Amazon.com. If you go to Amazon, put my name in, The key is to spell it right. Ryczek. And you do that, all my books will pop up.
We actually have a couple of them in the chapter library that we treasure for our membership. And Ben's still going. He says, try spelling Abel right. We know how to spell your name, Ben. We got you. All right. Hey, we're back Wednesday night, guys and gals, December 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern, when the East Coast Cooperative brings you Dan Wallach, another fellow SABR member who's going to be discussing his podcast, My Baseball History. This is going to be a very, very interesting presentation that you're not going to want to miss. The sign-up link is included in the chapter meeting booklet, and it is posted at SABR's events calendar at sabr.org/events. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you're not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research communities, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Dixie, say something. Get that on camera.
Join SABR.
Joe, get that pennant on camera, my man.
It's there.
Oops, there we go.
There we go. He's got a pennant that's from SABR 50. All right, Bill, you're fantastic. I can't thank you enough for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is fantastic. We look forward to reading that book, and let's get everybody out of here. We'll see everybody Wednesday night. Have a good night, everybody.